If you played video games in the early 90s, you remember the great console war. Mario versus Sonic. Sega does what Nintendo don't. Brash marketing versus classic games, all that stuff. This video game battle played out in multiple arenas. Nintendo, of course, was successful and left Sega in the dust. However, the battle played out in more than their main consoles. It also played out in the portable console arena. I want to contrast two major handheld consoles of their generation, the Game Boy and the Game Gear, and specifically talk about why the Game Gear never hit the same heights of success as the Game Boy. First, a quick look at the Game Boy, and let's be clear, it was one of the most successful handheld consoles of all time, and it paved the way for other consoles to be even more successful. The portable device made its world premiere in 1989. Now, it was not the first handheld device, but it had a variety of advantages that similarly suited devices didn't have, including the Nintendo brand name, a robust library of over 1,000 games, and an innovative system that moved from the dot matrix displays ultimately to color. The Game Boy lasted an astonishing 14 years. By the time it was discontinued in 2003, it sold more than 118 million units. That actually makes it the fourth best selling console ever. What's even more interesting about the longevity of this system is that it succeeded despite the fact that other systems were more technologically advanced. That includes the Game Gear, although it also includes the Atari Lynx and NEC Turbo Express. Let's start at the beginning. The Game Gear got a late start, and a staggered one when compared to the Game Boy. The Game Gear came out in 1990, then made its North American and European premiere in 1991, 2 years after the 1989 premiere of the Game Boy. Recognizing the challenge that Game Boy presented, Sega realized they had to go big. They created the Game Gear to basically be a smaller version of the Sega Master System, the precursor to the Genesis. The Sega Game Gear was different, and in some ways better, than the Game Boy, Lynx, and Turbo Express. It had a horizontal orientation that was easier to hold, along with curved surfaces that were meant to make the system more ergonomic. The system was also capable of displaying 4,096 colors, of which 32 could be displayed at the same time. All of this led to a pretty robust system. But when it came to sales, the Game Gear wasn't even close. By the time it was discontinued, the system sold about 10.6 million units, a drop in the bucket compared to the 118 million of Game Boy. Now, the Game Gear did beat the Atari Lynx, which sold 2 million units. It also beat the Turbo Express, which sold only 1.5 million units. But Sega was trying to kill the king. It was trying to dethrone Nintendo, and it failed, despite the fact that it had a more powerful system. This begs the question, why? As is usually the case, there are a lot of reasons that the Game Gear didn't compete with the Game Boy, despite its relative technological advantages. Let's start with the system itself. When you played the Game Boy, you weren't looking for the latest in technology. The lack of relative technological innovation was a conscious decision by Nintendo, who intentionally steered away from cutting edge tech in order to give consumers game systems that were more reliable, usable, and convenient. Yes, the grayscale screen of the Game Boy didn't pop the way that the color screen of the Game Gear did, but that came with some advantages. Chief among them was battery life. The original Game Boy used 4 AA batteries. You could get 30 hours of playtime off of those batteries alone. Later versions of the Game Boy, including the Game Boy Pocket, went even further, allowing players 10 hours of battery life on 2 AAA batteries. The Game Gear, it used 6 AA batteries. And for more batteries than the Game Boy, you got 3 to 5 hours of playtime. In the worst case scenario, this meant that 2 more batteries would get you 10% of the playtime. That is terrible. It's also expensive, and it's also inconvenient. Imagine going on a long car trip, but needing to bring extra batteries so you could keep playing your favorite video game for the entire ride. Yes, there were electric adapters that you could plug into an outlet, but that sort of defeated the purpose of the Game Gear. Further compounding the problem was that the system ran hot. I mean that literally. It actually warmed your hands. This meant that your hands would sweat while playing, and no one likes sweaty hands. The problem alone would seem to make the theoretical ergonomic advantages to the Game Gear not worth it. I also think it's worth taking a look at the game library for both systems. Again, let's review. The Game Boy had more than 1,000 games during its decade-plus career. Obviously, like any system, some of those games were of varying quality, but a lot of these games were amazing. For example, the Game Boy's success is largely responsible for making Tetris as popular as it was, as the game was a pack-in game from many regions when the system premiered. Now, Game Gear did have good games. Sonic 2, Sonic Triple Trouble, Shinobi 2, and Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse are but a handful. The system also sold adapters for the Master System that allowed the Game Gear to play Master System games. However, many of the games were just ports from the Master System. It's also worth considering that this was the late 80s and early 90s when Nintendo's domination of the video game market was so extreme that third-party developers were locked into a contract that required exclusivity with Nintendo. In other words, developers couldn't make games for Sega or the Game Gear. Legal concerns and pressure from other developers would eventually force changes to the arrangement, but that didn't happen until years after the Game Gear had been on the market. By then, the damage had been done. Changes would come, but those came much later. This put Sega further behind the eight ball in terms of game library size and quality. Sega's vaunted marketing machine also couldn't keep up with Nintendo's investment or their head start. Sega was briefly able to get a greater market share in terms of video game console systems by savvy marketing positioning. Sega branded themselves as the mature system. Nintendo was for little kids. Now, Sega continued its style of marketing with the Game Gear. Game Gear commercials showed side-by-side comparisons of Nintendo and called players fat idiots. No, seriously, that's pretty much what they did. They also said that only people who were colorblind would like the Game Boy, to which Nintendo responded with outrage and attempts to organize protests at Sega headquarters. In Japan, advertisements focused on having Japanese women holding the Game Gear. So, more traditional approach. But here's where the company's financial situations started to make a difference. Way back in 1965, Nintendo almost went bankrupt. From that time forward, the company had a zero debt policy. That meant that Nintendo never had to worry about paying down its debt and instead could take its money and invest it in products. Sega? Not so much. The company never generated the revenue that Nintendo did, and it had problems with debt from the 1990s on. In fact, its problems were so significant that the chairman of Sega Enterprises, Isao Okawa, lent the company $40 million to fund the Dreamcast in the 1990s, ultimately forgiving the debt upon his death and returning company stock to Sega in his will. Wow. The point is that Nintendo had the money to support a robust marketing effort. In 1989, when the Game Boy was launched, that launch was supported by a $10 million marketing investment that helped shoot the Game Boy out of the gate and achieve record sales. Sega could never compete, and the resource-starved nature of the company ultimately reared its head in other ways too. For example, Sega steered marketing and research dollars away from the Game Gear, pushing that money towards the development of the 32X, which we covered in our last video on console failures, and then eventually the Sega Saturn. Neither of those systems were tremendously successful, hurting the Game Gear's prospects even further. Nintendo and the Game Boy continued to evolve. The Game Boy Pocket, a smaller version that ran on two AAA batteries, further enhanced Nintendo's dominance over the handheld market, and new games kept pushing the system to new heights. In 1996, Pokemon Red, Green, Blue, and eventually Yellow came out. The nature of those games encouraged players to play with the Game Link cable, and Sega didn't have the technology or the games to compete. If you were a kid then, you probably remember it. You watched your friends play with the Game Link, and you had to go get that system too. Sega did look to a new system in the mid-90s, potentially replacing the Game Gear with a 16-bit version. However, this unnamed prototype would have cost $289, and other systems needed to be supported by Sega, so the project was shelved in favor of the Genesis Nomad. This system was essentially a portable version of the Sega Genesis that was only sold in North America. However, stop me if you heard this one before, Sega couldn't give this new system the support it deserved, and the marketing confusion further muddied the waters. Sega said that the new system was never meant to replace the Game Gear and only meant to serve as a supplemental console. Like the Game Gear, the Nomad took 6 AA batteries that would last you 4 hours. New system, same problems. It didn't work. With multiple consoles and inadequate resources, the Nomad never went anywhere. It could play Genesis games, but none of the games for the Master System, 32X, or Saturn, all of which were around during the Nomad's lifespan. The system was discontinued by 1999, having never truly made a dent on the market. Left to a confusing ecosystem of systems, consoles, and games, the Game Gear floundered. The system was ultimately discontinued in 1997. All of that being said, the Game Gear was not a commercial failure. It wasn't one of the worst systems of all time. As far as fourth-generation consoles go, it actually came in second. Yes, it wasn't anywhere close to the Game Boy, and sold only about 5% of the total units of Nintendo's system, but it still made its mark, and it was, by far, more commercially successful than the Lynx or the Turbo Express. The system also achieved international success. At one point in 1992, Game Gear had a 40% market share of the portable game unit in Europe. The Game Gear's failures could largely be attributed to Sega's strategic choices rather than the system itself. From a technical perspective, save for the battery issues, it was the superior system. The problem was Sega's mistakes. They never gave the system the long-term investment in game creation or marketing support that it needed or deserved. Yes, a lack of third-party games hurt the system, but it wasn't as if Sega couldn't see that one coming. They could have invested in stronger first-party development. Instead, Sega spread their money around in other systems, including the Nomad, 32X, and Saturn. And it made various mistakes with those consoles as well. In the end, honestly, the Game Gear was a great system, but it was one that never got to live up to its true potential. And that is it for this edition of Almost Something. As always, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like or subscribe, especially subscribe. That really helps get this channel off of the ground. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I liked making it. Take care, folks.